Welcome to The Silent Verdict.
With Clara Monroe and Elias Gray.
You know, it's pretty wild how a simple dispute over rent can spiral into something, well, something almost unbelievable. This story is exactly that. And it all revolves around one single, absolutely staggering number. So take a look at this. $21,240. Now that's not the total amount of rent that was owed. It's not even the original debt. Nope. This is just the late fee, a penalty that just kept growing and growing until it took on a life of its own. And that's the big question here, right? How in the world does a penalty for being late balloon into a sum this massive? It's a fascinating story about a contract, a huge court delay, and a legal rule that, as you'll see, can be more powerful than our idea of fairness.
Okay, so our story kicks off in Kansas. At the center of it, you've got a tenant and her landlord. The real trouble started back in 2020 over a few months of allegedly unpaid rent. But the seeds for this whole thing, they were actually planted a couple of years earlier.
It all goes back to the lease agreement they both signed in 2018. The rent was $1,900 a month. Pretty standard. But buried in that contract was this crucial clause, a late fee of $20 for every single day the rent was past due. A small number, but one that would have these enormous consequences. So in 2020, things come to a head. The landlord says the tenant missed 3 months of rent, which adds up to $5,700. He takes her to court to get it. But here's a complication. The tenant also worked for the landlord, doing jobs on his other properties. So their finances were already kind of tangled up.
On the surface, this seems pretty straightforward, doesn't it? Just a landlord-tenant dispute over a few $1,000s. But the real problem here wasn't actually the rent. The real problem was time, a lot of time.
And this is where things get really wild. Normally, these kinds of cases are supposed to be fast. You're in court in like 2 weeks. But this case, filed in September of 2020, didn't actually get to trial until March of 2023. That is a 2.5-year delay. And for every single one of those days, that $20 late fee was just ticking away. 1,062 days. For 1,062 days, that late fee just kept piling up while the case sat in line, waiting for its day in court. $20 a day, every day for almost 3 years. You can start to see how this number got so out of control.
So the case finally gets to court, but trust me, that's just where the ride begins. This whole dispute would go on a total legal roller coaster, bouncing through 3 different levels of the Kansas court system, and each one came up with a totally different answer.
First stop, the district court. The judge basically looks at the contract, looks at the calendar, and does the math. And the ruling is a complete bombshell. The tenant owes the rent, $5,700, plus the full $21,240 in late fees. You know, the court did mention that the landlord owed the tenant about $545 for other work, but that's a tiny drop in this massive bucket.
Facing this jaw-dropping judgment, the tenant's attorney appeals. And they do it based on one powerful legal idea: that a $21,000 penalty on a $5,700 debt was, in a single word, unconscionable. It was just too fundamentally unfair to be enforced by a court. So what does that fancy legal word even mean? Well, unconscionability is basically the court's escape hatch. It's a rule that lets a judge step in when a contract or a fee is so ridiculously one-sided, so oppressive, that it just shocks the conscience and offends a basic sense of justice. And you know what? The Court of Appeals agreed. They looked at the situation, this massive fee caused by a really unusual court delay, and they called it unconscionable. In a huge reversal, they slashed that penalty from over $21,000 all the way down to just $1,700. For a moment, it really seemed like fairness had won.
So it felt like justice was served, right? A huge victory. But the story wasn't over. The landlord decided to take one last shot, appealing the decision all the way up to the Kansas Supreme Court. And what happened there? Well, it turned the entire case on its head one last time.
This brings us to the final and honestly the most surprising chapter of this whole saga. The case lands in front of the highest court in the state, and the justices there delivered a ruling that really shows how, in the law, The rules of the game can be way more important than the game itself.
In a stunning, unanimous decision, meaning every single justice agreed, the Kansas Supreme Court reversed the Court of Appeals. Just like that, they wiped away that smaller fee and brought the original $21,000 judgment roaring back to life. The massive late fee was officially back.
And this is the part that probably has you scratching your head, right? Why? Why on earth would the state's highest court bring back a fee that another court had just called fundamentally unfair, even offensive? Well, the answer has absolutely nothing to do with the fee itself. See, here's the crucial thing to get. The Supreme Court never actually ruled on whether the fee was fair or not. Their entire decision came down to a completely different question. Was the argument about unfairness made correctly and at the right time according to the strict rules of the court?
Here's the technicality that decided everything. The Supreme Court found that the tenants' lawyers didn't properly argue the unconscionality issue at the very first trial in district court. And because that argument wasn't made correctly right at the beginning, the rules say it couldn't even be considered by the Court of Appeals later on. The case was lost, not on fairness, but on a procedural misstep.
So after this incredible legal journey, what's the big takeaway? Well, this case is a really powerful and frankly kind of harsh reminder of a fundamental truth about our justice system. It really all boils down to this. In a courtroom, how you argue and when you argue can be way more important than what you're actually arguing about. You can have the best, most common sense point in the world, but if you don't follow the precise rules, it might as well not exist. And that leaves us with a final and pretty difficult question. I mean, these rules, these procedures, they exist to create order and fairness for everyone. But when they lead to a result like this, upholding a $21,000 late fee on a technicality, it really makes you wonder, does a system that prioritizes procedure over what feels fair always serve the cause of justice? That is definitely something to think about.